July 21, 2020. Lingig, Surigao del Sur. A remote island at the southern edge of the Philippines. Police boats cut through the water before sunrise. Inside their vests, arrest warrants. Inside the compound ahead, a man the government has hunted for 6 months. A man 5 million people once called a prophet. He calls himself Pastor Joel. His followers call him a modern-day Moses. The Securities and Exchange Commission calls him something else entirely. The architect of the largest investment fraud in Philippine history. Gunfire erupts before the sun is fully up. Automatic rifles, a sniper rifle, a machine gun. And inside the compound, 2 rocket-propelled grenades ready to be used. By the time the shooting stops, 2 of his bodyguards are dead. 23 of his companions are in cuffs. And there, finally cornered after half a year underground, is the man himself, Joel Apolinario. This is not a drug lord's compound. This is not a rebel stronghold. This is the final hideout of a man who built an empire, not with weapons, but with a promise. A promise of 30% every single month for life. At its peak, over 5 million Filipinos handed their savings to this man. Farmers, fishermen, teachers, overseas workers who sent home years of hard-earned wages, all believing they'd found the one investment that could never fail. They called it a blessing. Regulators called it something else, a Ponzi scheme, one so large it would eventually be measured not in millions, but in an estimated 100 billion pesos. So how does a former radio DJ from a small coastal town become the center of a financial catastrophe that swallowed an entire region of the country? To understand the collapse, we have to go back before the raids, back before the money. Back to a boy from Hinatuan who grew up with nothing at all. Long before he was Pastor Joel, he was just Joel Apolinario, a boy from Hinatuan, a coastal town in Surigao del Sur in the southern Philippines. By his own followers' accounts, his early life was ordinary in the hardest way. He fished, he worked construction. He knew firsthand what it meant to not have enough. In a region where farming and fishing barely covered a family's needs, poverty wasn't an idea. It was the daily condition of nearly everyone he knew. And it's that detail that matters most to this story, because everything Apolinario would eventually build was aimed deliberately at people just like the family he came from. Eventually, he found steadier work, not in the fields, but on the airwaves. For roughly a decade, Apolinario worked as a DJ and technician at a small radio station in Bislig City. It was a modest job, but it gave him something more valuable than a paycheck: a voice, a presence, and a name that an entire town would come to recognize. Radio hosts in provincial Philippine towns often become informal community figures. Trusted voices people invite into their homes every day. Whether or not he planned it, Apolinario was quietly building the one asset every con depends on: familiarity, trust. Around this same period, Apolinario also began lending small amounts of money to people in his community. Informal, personal loans to neighbors who had nowhere else to turn. And people began doing something unusual in return. They started giving him money. Not as loans, as donations, as gifts, as faith. Word spread the way it always does in small towns, mouth to mouth, porch to porch. The man from the radio station was helping people, and the more people gave, the more he had to give back. It felt, to those on the inside, like a virtuous cycle. It was, in truth, the very first primitive engine of a Ponzi scheme. New contributions quietly funding payouts to earlier believers. By 2016, the informal network had grown large enough to need a legal face. Apolinario secured a business permit from the local government of Bislig for something called Capaco Convenience Store and General Merchandise. On paper, a small retail shop. In practice, the seed of something far bigger. Even in this early period, there were warning signs. Local authorities shut the operation down at one point for failing to comply with municipal requirements. Over 100 cases were filed against Apolinario for failing to settle claims. Arrest warrants were issued. And then, in a pattern that would repeat itself for years, the cases were dismissed after complainants were quietly paid back. It's a pattern worth pausing on because it's the exact mechanism that lets a Ponzi scheme survive its first brushes with the law. Pay back just enough of the loudest complainers, and the machine keeps running. The debts don't disappear. They just get pushed further down the line onto people who haven't joined yet. In March 2017, the business took its final defining form. Apolinario renamed it Kappa Community Ministry International. Kappa, short for a Cebuano phrase meaning enrich the poor. No longer a convenience store, now officially a religious ministry. And that single rebrand changed everything. Because a religious organization, unlike a bank or an investment firm, doesn't answer to financial regulators. It answers to faith. Under the banner of a ministry, what had been an informal money network could now call every payment a love offering. Every fixed monthly payout, a blessing. The offer, stripped of its religious language, was simple. Donate at least 10,000 pesos. In exchange, receive a monthly blessing equal to 30% of that amount, for life. No labor required, no real business model disclosed, just faith and a certificate. To the man now known across the region as Pastor Joel, this wasn't fraud. In his own defense later, he would insist this was simply tithing, biblical generosity, freely given and freely returned, protected by religious freedom itself. To millions of Filipinos struggling under the same poverty he once knew, it didn't sound like a scam. It sounded like deliverance. Whether he began as a true believer in his own mission or recognized early on exactly what he was building, the machine was now in motion. And it was about to grow far larger and far faster than any small-town lending circle ever could. From its base in Bislig, Kappa expanded with startling speed. What started in one coastal city spread across southern Mindanao, then beyond. Branch after branch, chapter after chapter, each one recruiting the next. The math should have set off alarms immediately. A 30% return every single month for life is not a yield. It's an arithmetic impossibility. To sustain it, Kappa would have needed to bring in an estimated 15 billion pesos every single month just to pay its members what it promised. No legitimate business on earth generates returns like that. The Securities and Exchange Commission saw it too, and saw it early. As far back as March 2017, the SEC issued its first public advisory, warning the public about Kappa's Ponzi-like characteristics. It would be one of the earliest, clearest red flags of the entire saga. But the warnings landed on deaf ears, drowned out by testimonials. Early members really were getting paid. And word of that success traveled faster than any regulatory notice ever could. Meanwhile, investigators later found that Apolinario and his wife had acquired 9 luxury vehicles in just 2 years, a lifestyle utterly disconnected from a non-profit ministry for the poor. By 2019, Kappa's founder was claiming 5 million members nationwide, a following so large, so devoted, that when the government finally moved against them, it wasn't quiet resignation that followed. It was outrage. Supporters petitioned courts. They accused the government of being anti-poor. Some called for the president himself to be removed from office for daring to shut down their profit. On February 14, 2019, the SEC issued a formal cease and desist order. It became permanent the following month. In April, Kappa's certificate of incorporation was revoked outright. Legally, the company no longer existed, and still, the money kept moving. Then President Rodrigo Duterte took the unusual step of personally warning the public against the group, calling it a continuing crime, and ordering police and the National Bureau of Investigation to make arrests. In June 2019, the Anti-Money Laundering Council secured a court order freezing Kappa's assets. Faced with the freeze, Apolinario appeared in a video message, not defiant, but pleading, asking the very government pursuing him to help Kappa return its members' money. It was, in hindsight, the sound of a machine running out of new investors to feed it. By early 2020, arrest warrants stretched across the country. Bislig City, Cagayan de Oro, Manila. Apolinario went underground. For more than 6 months, one of the most recognized faces in the country simply vanished. Which brings us back to where we began. July 21st, 2020. That hidden compound on an island in Lingig. The gunfire. The rocket-propelled grenades that were never fired. 2 bodyguards killed. And at the end of it, Joel Apolinario, the boy from Hinatuan, the radio DJ, the prophet of 30% for life, let out in handcuffs. The legal reckoning took years. It wasn't until December 12, 2023, more than 4 years after the first SEC warning, that a regional court in Butuan City finally delivered its verdict. Apolinario, along with fellow incorporators Cristobal Baradad and Joji Jusay, was found guilty on 8 counts of syndicated estafa. The sentence? Life imprisonment. The court didn't mince words in its ruling, stating plainly that the men had employed fraud, falsely presenting themselves as authorized to run a profit-making enterprise when, as a non-stock religious corporation, they never were. By the time the final judgment came down, prosecutors estimated the total damage at roughly 100 billion pesos, drawn from millions of members across the country. Money that, for the vast majority who joined after the machine had already begun to run dry, was simply gone. To this day, some of Apollinario's earliest and most devoted followers still defend him, insisting he was a man of God, unfairly persecuted by a government that never understood faith. It's a devotion that, in many ways, is the most enduring mystery of the entire case. How a promise this mathematically impossible could command belief this deep, this lasting, from millions of people who had every reason to know better. Because in the end, COPPA wasn't just a financial crime. It was a portrait of what happens when hope and desperation meet a man willing to promise anything. And in a country where an estimated 1 in 5 families lives below the poverty line, that promise, a modern-day loaves and fishes, 30% a month for life, will always find someone ready to believe.